The fuse burns up to an explosion. Now I'm going to show you something kind of weird. It turns out that I can learn a lot about the suspect, not just from the fuse, but from the timing of the fuse. Like, I'm trying to figure out what happened in there, okay? Well, I can figure this out because it's about why didn't it happen here? My guy who did this, he did it over there. Why didn't he do it over here? Why didn't he do it over here? Why didn't he do it later in time? Why did he pick that time to do it? The timing will sometimes give away the identity of the killer. So I'm asking the question, why did this happen, where it happened, and why did this happen when it happened? Make sense? So let me give you a timeline. Here's a timeline of a crime I describe in this book. So in May of 2000, this woman goes missing. She disappears. That was the day that a bomb exploded. But that explosion was preceded by a bunch of events in the fuse. And these events in the fuse created a moment of opportunity for the killer. I'm going to give it to you so you can see it. So for example, I had to work it in my city because it occurred in my city. Well, it couldn't occur in my city unless they were living in my city and they had moved in my city. Why? Because he got a job over here at an auto shop. So it wouldn't have happened until this occurs. And then they actually moved, so now I have this occurs. So if I'm going to work it, because it happens in my city, it has to happen in the overlap of these two things, which I will call the red zone. Because it happened in the red zone, I had to investigate it. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, it turns out he decided that after he killed her, he was going to dispose of her body by basically, this is before Breaking Bad. I don't know how I got the idea, but he decided he was going to dissolve her in acid. But he needed a tub to do it. He needed a barrel. And he had a barrel because he had a friend, and this friend had a barrel in his garage. Why? Because his employer had given to him earlier. No barrel, no way to dispose of the body. He's not going to do this until he has a way to get rid of the body. So it turns out the red zone is now slightly smaller. It's over here. He has to have a barrel. So instead of being this big, the red zone is smaller. The crime is going to happen in that red zone. He had to get the acid. He did some research on this, let me tell you. And we had a company that opened up in our city that sold acid. It only opened up about a year or two earlier. So if that company didn't exist, I'm not sure where he would have got the acid, but he couldn't do it until he had the acid. He had the acid over here. The red zone is now smaller. That's when he's going to kill her. That make sense? But it turns out she was pregnant. He did not want that kid. That pregnancy started a timer that works in the opposite direction. If he wants to get rid of her before she delivers the baby, so she's not doing a double, two murders, he has to act now in this time, sometime before she has the baby. Make sense? And if he's trying to do it before she can even tell anybody, or even before she is showing, so anybody else knows she's pregnant, well, now he has to operate before this deadline. Now look how small my red zone is. It's right here. Oh, and guess when she got killed? Right there. The red zone tells me who did it because his red zone is specific to him. Does that make sense? Why am I showing you this? Because I just showed you a spiritual fuse. It leads up to Jesus. The question is, if there is a God who wants to arrive and meet the expectations of people who have been thinking about God, then he has to arrive when the worship of as many gods is happening at the same time. In other words, gods start to be worshipped like Osiris, and then their worship ends in history. If God wants to show up when people who have some of the common similarities to Jesus are worshiping Osiris, he has to show up in that timeline. Now I'm going to add for you all the other mythologies that occur after Osiris, but before Jesus. And I just want you to see some of them they end earlier, some end later, some are still being worshipped today. Indra is part of Hinduism. So you can see here they are, they're just all overlapped. All the gods I showed you on the timeline, I'm now showing you on this red zone. Okay? You know what? Red Zone's actually that football show every day, right? Or on every Sunday. Scott Hansen is actually a good friend, and he is a solid Christian guy. He's the host of the Red Zone. I should call him and tell him I'm doing this. Anyway, the point is, here's all these gods now, and their overlaps. I just want you to see their overlaps. Okay, we're getting close. There they are. Now we're down to just before Jesus. So it turns out, if God wanted to show up when the most people are worshiping the most gods possible that resemble Jesus, because they're thinking partially about God, where Jesus is the full body of God, he has to show up in this red zone between those dates. Interestingly, I didn't show you another fuse called the cultural fuse, but I'll give you a little picture of it today. If God wants to show up at a time when others can be told about Jesus, he has to wait for certain things in history to take place. So, for example, the cultural fuse starts with the Roman Empire. It turns out that these were areas that were controlled by lots of different groups that didn't even speak the same language. But then when Rome comes along, Rome starts to unify these. And not only that, it starts to pick common alphabet called the Etruscan alphabet. So now everyone's using the same alphabet. They're also speaking Greek. Rome did that to the entire region. The largest section of the known world became the Roman Empire. Then they start to build roads. There were no ways to there was no road for Paul to walk on to share the gospel with anyone until the Roman Empire started to build those roads. Not only that, mail systems were developed by Rome, and there was a period of stability in which you could actually advance a worldview, and there was 200 years of peace so that Paul could safely travel the message of the gospel all over the Roman Empire. That's called the Pax Romana. If God wanted to arrive with the overlap of both the spiritual fuse and the cultural fuse, he has to come now, at that point. Oh, but there's one more I didn't talk about. That's the prophetic fuse. The Jewish prophets predicted Jesus would come. One of them was a guy named Daniel. And Daniel said that the Messiah would come sometime between the decree to go back and rebuild Jerusalem, which we have a date for, and the destruction of the temple, which we have a date for. Oh, really? If that Daniel prophecy is correct, now God has to act in this red zone. Now, I didn't know what to find when I started this whole red zone thing, okay? When I started doing this and I had my 3 different fuses, I had no idea what the red zone would be. But this is the red zone. If I didn't know anything, if I didn't know when the Common Era started, you could figure this out because there's a red zone. And this red zone just happens to divide all of history from BCE to CE. It just happens to hit right there. Why would that be the case? What is happening right there in history that changes everything? Well, I think you know. Somebody shows up here. Who is this guy? Somebody showed up at this point in the red zone and divided history. Do some research. Here's every other prominent figure in the first century. Who is the person of interest? I'll just give you all the other prominent figures in the first century. There they are. And I'm talking about all over the globe. From China all the way. This is every prominent person in the first century. Look at those names, folks. You don't even recognize most of those names. Most of these folks have been lost in history. Some are still out there, like Cleopatra. You probably know that name, right? None of them had the impact, though, of one person of interest.